Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. Diep was mistaken for a maid and humiliated by James's secretary. But will James step in to protect her? If you love stories where the quiet ones carry the biggest hearts, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. This story will break you and heal you. The morning arrived shrouded in an unusual silence. Without electricity, the house sat in shadows, its walls soaked in gray. Diep stirred beneath a thin blanket, her breathing faint and slow. Her fingers brushed her temple as she tried to remember where she was. The faint scent of old wood and herbal tea told her it wasn't home. But then again, where was home now? She pushed herself up slowly, her head still light. Fever had taken most of her strength, but something heavier pressed on her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Footsteps tapped along the tiled floor. Then came a brisk, unfamiliar voice. "Are you the housemaid here? Could you peel some fruit for me?" Diep looked up, caught off guard. The woman didn't wait for an answer. She had already turned away. Diep lowered her eyes and nodded, her voice almost inaudible. "Yes, okay." A moment later, another command followed. "My shoes! I walked outside earlier. Can you clean them?" Before she could respond, another voice, calmer and firmer, cut through the moment. "She's not the maid. She's a guest." Trang's face flushed. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Diep managed a faint smile. "It's all right." But it wasn't. Not really. In that small pause, between what was said and what was meant, something inside her shifted. A quiet wall built itself, brick by brick. James hadn't arrived yet. But already, a tension hung in the air, like the moment before rain, when everything holds its breath. Trang lingered near the kitchen doorway, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. Her voice, earlier sharp and confident, now carried hesitation. "I truly didn't mean to offend. I thought you were..." Diep turned from the window, where soft morning light was beginning to leak through the curtains. Her eyes were gentle, but distant. "It's all right. People often assume..." That simple sentence carried years beneath it. Trang heard it, not just the words, but the quiet weight behind them. She stepped closer, unsure. "You're working here?" Diep nodded. "I'm just starting. Your aunt, James's mother, arranged for me to help with some projects." James's mother entered then, her presence calm, watchful. She poured a cup of warm tea and offered it to Diep before turning to Trang. "She's been through a lot. Mokoi tu nyo. It's important we treat her with kindness." Trang lowered her head. "I'll be more careful, I promise." Diep gave her a soft look. Not forgiveness, not resistance. Just space. The air between them began to ease slightly. Not warmth, not yet, but a mutual understanding that silence could be more healing than explanation. "I'm Trang, by the way," she said, offering a hand. "I used to study with James. Long time ago." "Diep," she replied. 23. I didn't study much. Life kept getting in the way." They both smiled faintly. Two women from different paths, now under the same roof, trying not to step on each other's shadows. From upstairs, the floor creaked. Footsteps. James had returned. And in that quiet, hearts shifted slightly, preparing for someone neither of them truly knew anymore. But both were about to meet again. The front door opened with a soft click, not loud enough to announce, just enough to shift the air. James stepped inside, posture straight, presence calm. But behind his composed face was the tiredness of someone who had held too much, too long. His mother greeted him with a gentle smile. He leaned down, kissed her cheek with quiet respect. Then his eyes found Diep. She stood near the corner, her figure partially lit by morning light. Their eyes met, just briefly, and in that pause, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't recognition. Not yet. Just awareness. Trang stepped forward, too quickly. "Hi, James," she said, her tone bright. "It's been a while." He nodded. "Good to see you again." But his gaze didn't linger. "I'll take Diep back to the farm," he said calmly. His mother nodded. Diep offered a polite goodbye and followed him out. The ride was quiet. No words, just the hum of tires on dirt roads and the soft rustle of wind through open windows. Diep stared out, watching the rice fields blur past. James, hand steady on the wheel, glanced at her only once, when he thought she wouldn't notice. But she did. When they reached the farm, she stepped down, murmuring a thank you. Her hand brushed his sleeve lightly. Accidental. Gentle. She disappeared into the small house. James didn't drive off. He sat in silence, eyes on her door, wondering how a girl so quiet could stir a storm he didn't know he was carrying. Later that week, James returned, not to see Diep, or so he told himself, but to assess the progress of the new rice variety he had brought in. The sun was soft that day, casting long shadows across the paddies. A breeze stirred the leaves like whispers. A young woman from the agriculture board greeted him. "Septan couldn't make it, so he sent me to accompany you," she said with a polite nod. James responded with his usual calm. They walked through the fields, inspecting stalks of rice heavy with promise. He listened, nodded, offered insights. His voice was steady, his eyes thoughtful, but his heart was elsewhere. Behind his words about irrigation and soil pH, his mind drifted to Diep. He could almost see her, sitting under the shade of the storage shed, sorting fruit with quiet hands. As they surveyed the field, a local official approached, thanking James for his support. The villagers didn't believe at first, the man admitted. "But now, thanks to you, this crop will change lives." James smiled faintly. "It wasn't just me. The soil was ready. The people were willing." He didn't say what he truly felt, that success, while satisfying, wasn't filling the quiet ache he had started carrying since Diep entered his life. She was like these fields, patient, enduring, overlooked by many but quietly beautiful. And like the crop he planted, something in him had begun to grow. Slowly, stubbornly, without his permission. As he looked across the green horizon, the wind carried a faint scent of plum blossoms. For a moment, he forgot where work ended and where longing began. The sky was beginning to fade, dipped in soft apricot and blue. In the quiet of the farm, Diep sat by the open window, a small pot of rice simmering gently behind her. She looked at her phone once, then again. Her thumb hovered before she finally pressed call. "James?" Her voice was quiet, almost shy. "Hey, Diep, it's me." His voice came through, edged with fatigue but unmistakably warm. "Is everything all right?" "I just wanted to ask, have you finished work yet?" she said, trying to sound casual, though her fingers were nervously wrapped around the edge of her shirt. He chuckled softly. "Not yet. I'm still out here finishing things up. It's been a long day." A small pause. "If you're not too tired, maybe you could come by for dinner," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a longer silence now, filled only by the distant sounds of crickets and the rustle of wind against dry leaves. "I'd like that," James finally said. "But I may be a little late. Work's been a lot lately." "It's okay," Diep replied quickly. "I just thought if you had time, I'll start cooking anyway." He could hear something gentle in her voice, a softness he hadn't realized he missed until now. "Save me some rice," he said, smiling into the phone. "I will." As the call ended, Diep sat still for a moment, the phone resting against her chest. Outside, the wind stirred the trees like fingers brushing old memories, and in the distance, a man who had everything was now hurrying home. Not the sky was pearl gray when James arrived. Dew still clung to the leaves, and the earth smelled like something ancient, damp, full of memory. He found Diep kneeling near the edge of the field, her sleeves rolled, hands sunk gently into the soil. She didn't see him at first. Or maybe she did, and just didn't need to say anything. He stood there for a moment, watching her. The way she moved, careful, unhurried, like the world around her was sacred. There was no rush in her rhythm, no need to prove anything. And yet, in that stillness, she taught him more than any boardroom ever did. James took a breath, stepped closer. The mud squelched beneath his boots. "You always work this early?" he asked softly. Diep looked up, strands of hair framing her face. She smiled. Not the smile for politeness, not the one for strangers, just a small, real one. "The plants don't wait. Neither do feelings," he wanted to say, but didn't. Instead, they walked to the edge of the paddies together. He spoke of new projects, of plans for the community. She listened, then asked quietly, "And when will you rest?" James stopped walking. The question hung between them, soft as mist. Then, without turning, he asked, "If I chose peace over everything else, would you stay with me?" Diep didn't answer right away. The wind brushed past them like a sigh. But then, she reached for his hand. No ring, no promise, just skin on skin, real, warm, trembling, and that was enough. No rest, but to be near the quiet heart that waited for him. The wedding wasn't grand. There were no chandeliers, no string quartets, no headlines. Just a canvas tent by the rice fields, swaying slightly in the breeze. A few neighbors brought baskets of fruit. Someone played a flute off-key in the background. Diep wore a white linen dress she sewed herself. James rolled up his sleeves. It didn't matter, because when they looked at each other, there was a kind of silence, not empty, but full. Full of everything they didn't need to say anymore. For James, it wasn't a break from his world. It was a return to something more rooted, more honest. He had chased ambition long enough to know that not all victories glitter. Some just grow, slowly, like rice under sun and storm. And Diep, who had spent most of her life adapting, enduring, waiting, now found herself chosen. Not out of pity, not from obligation, but simply because someone saw her, truly saw her. Not the orphan girl, not the helper, just deep. That night, they sat together under a sky bursting with quiet stars. Their hands didn't part. The fields rustled around them as if blessing the life ahead. No one gave a speech. But in the silence, there was a lesson. Love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives like a season, unannounced, slow, persistent. And when it stays, it doesn't ask for applause. It just builds something, harvest by harvest, meal by meal, gaze by gaze, until one morning you wake up and realize you are no longer alone. Diep, a poor orphaned girl, comes to apply for a job at the company run by James's mother. James, a successful CEO who has just returned from abroad. On their first encounter, Diep is mistaken for a maid and treated with disrespect. James witnesses everything. He begins to notice her, not with grand gestures, but in quiet glances and unspoken care. Between rice fields and late dinners, the two slowly draw closer. One day, James asks, "If I choose peace, would you go with me?" And Diep simply nods. They decide to marry, not out of pity, not because of wealth, but because in each other they find something they both had lost, a sense of true peace.